There's a moment in every dynamic where the person who once bent over backwards suddenly stops. And for the avoidant, that moment is terrifying because the power they held, it disappears. This isn't about playing games. It's about reclaiming dignity. When a woman stops doing these 7 things, it's not drama, it's transformation, and it changes everything. She stops over-explaining herself to gain approval. At first, it doesn't seem like a big deal. It starts small. Less justification in her messages, fewer paragraphs defending how she feels, no more careful construction of every word to avoid triggering discomfort in him. But it's a massive shift because for a long time, she was used to walking on eggshells, trying to be perfectly understood. Every feeling she had came with a full essay explaining why she wasn't crazy, why she wasn't needy, why her emotions were valid, and why he shouldn't pull away. She used her words like a shield, hoping that if she just explained herself enough, she could earn a safe space in his life. But what she didn't realize then was that over-explaining wasn't connection. It was self-betrayal. It was the constant feeling of, I need to make him understand me or he'll leave. It was managing his emotional reactions instead of owning her truth. It was being more concerned with preserving his comfort than standing in her own. And she was tired. Tired of every conversation feeling like a negotiation. Tired of always trying to package her truth in a way that wouldn't scare him. Tired of trying to explain why something hurt her, only to be met with defensiveness, silence, or withdrawal. So she stopped. Not because she no longer cared, but because she finally understood that someone who wants to connect will lean in, not back away when things get real. She began to realize that her job isn't to win him over with clarity. It's to be herself fully and let the right person meet her there. That meant no longer trying to be the exception to his avoidant behavior, no longer bending her boundaries just to be heard, no longer giving TED Talks on emotional safety in the hopes he'd finally say, I get it now. When she stopped over-explaining, something powerful happened. Her words became fewer, but more impactful. She no longer rushed to clarify her tone or overcompensate when he seemed distant. She stopped sending those long, heartfelt messages that used to come from a place of anxiety just to smooth over tension he created. She saw that her worth didn't lie in how eloquently she could defend her feelings. Her feelings simply were. And they were valid, whether he got it or not. It confused him at first. The avoidant wasn't used to that silence, that self-assurance. He was used to the overthinking, the neediness disguised as logic, the energy that screamed, please don't pull away. Now he'd say something dismissive or go cold for a day, and she wouldn't chase the conversation down with explanations. She wouldn't fill the gap with justification. She let the silence be what it was. And in that space, he had to sit with himself, for once. The biggest irony? The very explanations she used to think would bring them closer were actually the things making her feel smaller. The more she explained, the less heard she felt. The more effort she poured into being understood, the more disconnected she became from herself. Stopping wasn't just a communication choice, it was an emotional breakthrough. She was no longer seeking approval through understanding. She was finally giving herself permission to feel what she felt, speak it clearly, and let go of whatever couldn't hold space for it. She stops initiating all the connection. At one point, it was so natural for her to be the one who reached out first. She didn't even think about it. She would send the good morning texts, check in during the day, share memes to keep the spark alive, and plan the dates so they had something to look forward to. If the conversation died, she revived it. If the energy dipped, she lifted it. If the intimacy faded, she chased it. It wasn't always desperate. It often came from love, from care, from a genuine desire to stay connected. But underneath that intention was a pattern she didn't want to admit. She was the engine of the relationship, and without her effort, everything stalled. This realization doesn't hit her all at once. It creeps in slowly through the tiredness of always being the emotional initiator. The unanswered texts that sit a little too long. The sense that if she didn't make the first move, nothing would happen at all. And that nagging question starts to surface more often. If I stopped trying, would he even notice? Or would the whole thing just fade into silence? It's a hard truth to face. That connection should be mutual, and that one-sided effort is not love, it's labor. Eventually, she reaches a point where initiating feels heavy, not because she doesn't care anymore, but because she finally starts to see the imbalance for what it is. Her effort isn't being met, it's being expected. Her presence isn't being appreciated, it's being taken for granted. And she realizes that her constant reaching out is part of a dynamic where he gets to stay emotionally distant while still enjoying the benefits of her closeness. The more she gives, the more he retreats, and somewhere along the way, it became normal for her to do the chasing while he did the deciding. So she stops, not out of anger or manipulation, but from exhaustion and clarity. She puts her phone down and doesn't send the first text. She waits to see if he'll follow up on the plans she used to make. She pauses before filling the silence with her usual light-hearted message or thoughtful check-in, and what she notices is telling. The silence becomes longer. The space she created doesn't get filled. The conversations become fewer, and instead of panic, she feels relief. Because the illusion breaks, it wasn't a mutual connection. It was her sustaining an emotional fantasy. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, this is the beginning of discomfort. He was used to her doing the emotional outreach. It allowed him to stay safe, to stay just detached enough while still feeling wanted. Her initiation made it easy for him to avoid vulnerability. As long as she reached out first, he didn't have to risk rejection or deal with intimacy on someone else's terms. Her silence doesn't just remove comfort, it exposes his pattern. Suddenly, he has to choose: engage or let the connection die. For the first time, the responsibility is shared. She watches this unfold, not with bitterness, but with a growing sense of peace. Because stepping back from initiating shows her something she never saw clearly before. Real connection isn't about who texts first or who plans the date. It's about emotional reciprocity. It's about someone wanting to meet you halfway, without needing to be reminded, coaxed, or convinced. When she stops initiating everything, she's no longer running a one-woman show pretending to be a relationship. She's finally giving space to see what and who shows up when she stops showing up for both of them. She stops rescuing him emotionally. For a long time, it felt like a role she didn't choose, but somehow became second nature. Whenever he shut down, she was the one trying to pull him back. When he had a bad day, she'd tiptoe around her own needs to protect his peace. When he seemed distant, she didn't ask why. She filled the space with warmth, reassurance, and emotional labor to make him feel safe. She made excuses for his mood swings, softened her language to keep him from feeling attacked, and carried the weight of both their emotional worlds on her shoulders. She told herself it was love, compassion, or empathy. But deep down, it was survival. If she could keep him okay, maybe he wouldn't leave. Maybe he wouldn't shut her out again. Maybe he'd finally feel safe enough to open up. But what began as empathy quickly turned into enabling. She started realizing that the more she rescued him, the less he grew. He never had to face his own discomfort because she was always there with the emotional balm. Every time he avoided conflict, she cleaned it up. Every time he withdrew, she reached in to fill the gap. Every time he gave her coldness, she responded with warmth, hoping to thaw the ice, and it drained her. Slowly, she began to feel invisible, because in the process of tending to his emotions, she had abandoned her own. This pattern became especially clear during moments when she needed support. When she cried, he froze. When she was vulnerable, he got uncomfortable. When she expressed disappointment, he deflected. And instead of getting her needs met, she found herself backpedaling, soothing his discomfort, and apologizing for having needs at all. She realized she wasn't in an emotional partnership. She was in an emotional parent-child dynamic, always doing the work he refused to do for himself. And while part of her felt guilty for even thinking that, another part of her started to whisper the truth. This wasn't healthy, and it wasn't sustainable. So she stopped. She stopped translating his silence into understanding. She stopped asking, "Are you okay?" Every time he shut down, knowing that question had become more about managing his mood than actually getting closer. She stopped blaming herself for his lack of emotional availability. She began to understand that rescuing someone from their own discomfort doesn't teach them how to swim. It teaches them to expect a lifeboat every time things get hard. And she was done being the lifeboat. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in moments, like the time she said what she felt without cushioning it for his comfort, the time she didn't rush to fix a conversation when he got quiet, the time she let him sit in his own emotional storm without running in to hold the umbrella. And it was in those moments that she saw how uncomfortable he became, not just because she had changed, but because he now had to confront parts of himself he was used to outsourcing to her. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, this shift is destabilizing. Her rescue missions had allowed him to bypass accountability. Without them, he had to sit with the very emotions he worked so hard to suppress. And in that space, she found clarity, not because he suddenly changed, but because she did. She stopped mistaking emotional overfunctioning for love. She stopped trying to prove her worth by how well she could carry someone else's emotional baggage. And she stopped assuming it was her job to save someone who never asked to be saved, only managed, soothed, and understood on his terms. She stops tolerating mixed signals. For a while, she tried to rationalize them. One day he was present, affectionate, even vulnerable, and the next he was cold, distracted, or completely unavailable. He would say things that sounded like commitment, but his actions told a different story. He would initiate just enough to keep the connection alive, but never enough to make her feel secure. And in the beginning, she interpreted it as complexity. She thought maybe he had walls, maybe he had trauma, maybe if she gave him enough time and love, those mixed signals would eventually become clear. She held on to the glimpses of connection and ignored the inconsistency that followed. She told herself that what they had was real, that it just needed time to unfold. But over time, she began to feel the emotional whiplash. The highs felt incredible, but the lows were confusing and painful. She found herself constantly questioning what she meant to him. She'd replay conversations, overanalyze his tone, read into texts, and try to decode the sudden shifts in his mood or behavior. She became fluent in ambiguity, trying to find certainty where there was none. And the emotional toll started to build. It wasn't just the uncertainty, it was the way it made her doubt herself. She started wondering if she was too much, too needy, too sensitive. She minimized her needs just to stay in the game, hoping that if she stayed cool enough, patient enough, low pressure enough, he'd finally be consistent. Eventually, the cost of staying in that confusion became greater than the fear of walking away. She stopped looking at mixed signals as a puzzle to solve and started seeing them as a boundary to enforce. She realized that someone who truly wants to build with you won't keep you guessing. She stopped accepting breadcrumbs in place of consistency. She stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to someone who kept offering doubt as the baseline experience. And most importantly, she stopped making excuses for the behavior that left her feeling anxious, disconnected, and emotionally undernourished. This shift didn't come from a place of anger, it came from clarity. She saw how often she filled in the blanks with optimism. She'd say, "He's just busy," instead of acknowledging the pattern. She'd convince herself that he cared deeply, but just didn't know how to show it. And when he pulled away after getting close, she told herself he was scared, not that he was unavailable. But that kind of narrative only kept her stuck. It delayed her healing. It kept her loyal to someone who wasn't offering anything solid. And when she finally said, "Enough," something in her clicked. She no longer cared why he was inconsistent, only that he was. For the avoidant, this is where things get uncomfortable. Mixed signals are their comfort zone. They thrive in the gray area because it gives them just enough connection without risking too much intimacy. They rely on the ambiguity to keep control, engaging when they feel safe, retreating when it gets too real. But when she stops playing that game, when she refuses to interpret vague behavior as affection, the power dynamic shifts. He can no longer control the pace with crumbs. He can't rely on her to keep chasing the version of him he only shows occasionally. She won't respond to sporadic messages with warmth anymore. She won't light up at inconsistent gestures. Her silence becomes a boundary, not a test. Her indifference to the confusion is the clearest signal she's ever given, because she no longer fears losing something that never felt truly secure in the first place. She stops making excuses for his emotional unavailability. For the longest time, she told herself stories to make his distance make sense. He's just been through a lot. He needs space to process. He cares. He's just not good at showing it. These explanations gave her comfort when his actions didn't. They gave her something to hold on to when he pulled away or avoided hard conversations. Every time he disappeared emotionally, she'd tell herself that it wasn't personal, that it was his past, his trauma, his stress. And maybe some of that was true, but the bigger truth was that he wasn't showing up, and she was the one doing the work of rationalizing that absence. She didn't want to see it that way because it would mean confronting how much of the relationship depended on her tolerance for being emotionally starved. She kept lowering the bar so he could clear it. She celebrated crumbs as if they were a feast. When he opened up once, she clung to it, ignoring the 10 times he shut down. When he made a vague promise about the future, she let that outweigh the present inaction. And when friends asked why he wasn't more emotionally available, she defended him. She painted the picture of a complicated man with a good heart who just needed the right person to unlock it. She hoped that if she loved him gently enough, patiently enough, he would eventually meet her where she was. But all the while, she was the one adapting. She was the one doing the emotional labor for two. She was the one pretending that his inconsistency was mystery, not avoidance. She began to notice how much of the relationship was built on potential instead of reality, how often she was waiting for change instead of experiencing connection, how much it hurt to always feel like she had to earn love instead of just receive it. And she began to feel tired in a way that no reassurance could fix, because it wasn't about fixing him. It was about finally seeing her own worth. So she stopped. She stopped playing the role of the understanding partner who always made room for his inability to show up. She stopped saying, "He's just not ready," as a way to delay her own clarity. She stopped defending emotional absences that left her feeling unseen and uncared for. She let go of the idea that it was her responsibility to hold space for someone who wasn't even trying to meet her halfway. And as she did, something shifted, not just in how she saw him, but in how she saw herself. No longer was she the one bending to fit his capacity. She began to ask, does he have the capacity to meet mine? She started to measure love not by what someone says they feel, but by how they show up consistently. She began to realize that emotional availability isn't something you drag out of someone. It's something that's offered freely when a person is ready, willing, and open. And when it's not there, no story, no excuse, no deep empathy can substitute for the real experience of being seen, heard, and held. For the avoidant, this creates friction. They're used to someone softening the edges for them, creating the safety net while they stay guarded. They rely on the emotional generosity of others to compensate for what they refuse to give. But when she stops excusing it, when she simply sees the lack of availability and refuses to decorate it with compassion, it forces a mirror in front of him. It disrupts the dynamic because she's no longer trying to love him into opening up. She's no longer trying to understand the maze of his behavior. She's simply observing what's there and choosing not to settle for it.